Hi, my name is Rosalie Marshall and I'm here today with Richard Thomas, who is the previous Information Commissioner, and we're here to discuss data privacy in this era of information overload. Richard has now moved on to become a global strategy advisor at law firm Hunton & Williams. Richard, hi. Firstly, before embarking on a new technology initiative, what should organisations do to ensure customer and staff privacy?
Be aware of the risks. People now recognise that data protection is really glorified risk assessment. There must be somebody at the top of the organisation, often a chief executive, it's a board level matter. They must identify the risks to the organisation, financial, reputational, and the risk to their customers, the risk to their staff, if personal data is not handled properly. And they've got to take a strategic approach to combine all the elements avoiding these risks. If it goes wrong, it's very painful. They've got to make sure the paperwork is right. You need lawyers to get the right policies, the right procedures. You've got to make sure that the IT is right, the software to encrypt your laptops, for example, to make sure that the data is being handled properly. And you've got to get the people right. People can be the weakest link. You've got to make your staff aware, you've got to train them, you've got to retrain them to be aware of what can happen if risks of data handling do actually materialise.
Right, okay, so that's how to ensure privacy, but actually, and the second question, how should customers, well, how should everyone, in fact individuals, all of them, stay in control of their data online? Is it possible, in fact, to stay in control of all your online data?
You're quite right. It's very difficult these days for all of us to keep track of what's happening to our personal data. We have laws in place which are supposed to tell us what's happening. We're supposed to give consent in many situations, but I fully recognise it's very difficult indeed. Technology these days means that data flows very freely across international borders. It can pass from one organisation to another, and we don't always know what's going on. But when I was Commissioner, we had a big programme to educate the general public, special programs to educate young people. What we did find was that people are very much aware and they are quite anxious about this, and often people feel they are losing control of their own data. But we said, be aware of what you're signing up to. Don't mishandle your own data. For example, on social networking sites, be aware that posting something now, maybe a wild night out as a student, could still be there in 10 years' time, doing damage to your career. And by and large, I think people are getting the message, and people are now focusing on the risks to themselves.
Okay, because that's actually interesting that you brought up social networks, because, well, it's on everyone's minds at the moment. In fact, we've just run a poll on B3, and the major reason why everyone's feeling so overloaded by information is because of these social networks. And so, what are your views on social networks? Should people be using them?
As a regulator, it's not my job to say something should not happen. I don't want to be a grumpy old man as a regulator saying social networking is a bad thing. And it's incredibly popular right across the world now. Millions, perhaps billions of people are signed up to various social networking sites. But the social networking sites, they must behave responsibly. They've got to educate people. They've got fantastic opportunity to do so with the sites themselves. But they've got to make sure that people can use the privacy settings, can opt in or opt out of the various settings, and know easily how to do it. But then by and large, the best people to look after someone's interests are the people themselves. So we've got to educate the people so they know what they're signing up to. I don't want to stop people enjoying themselves, don't want to stop them engaging with social networks, but they must be aware that if things go wrong, there could be dire consequences.
Okay, thanks. So moving on now from your general views on privacy and more to your history at the ICO. When you first started there, you had to make big decisions on cookies on websites and employee monitoring in the workplace. How is that? What was the experience like in those?
Well, I was Commissioner for 6.5, nearly 7 years, and had plenty of big decisions both on freedom of information and data protection. I adopted a strategic approach. I said we had to be selective in order to be effective. And I focused very much on our education work, on our policy work, on our complaint handling work, and our enforcement work when we were the tough regulator, the policeman. And yes, we had new things coming all the time. You mentioned cookies, you mentioned the employment code, and we had to deal with these as we came along. I'm very proud of the work we did to the employment code. When I started, it was a bit long, a bit gobbledygooky, and I took a decision then to refocus that, to make it more user-friendly for small businesses, another version for middle-sized businesses, and another one for the large corporations. And we said, your staff are your most valuable asset. Therefore, treat their personal data with respect. People don't like being spied on in the workplace unless absolutely necessary, and you tell them what's going on. Big concerns, for example, about employers looking at email traffic. And we, in our code of practice, which was eventually published about a year after I started in 2005, that was very much welcomed by the employers, by the trade unions, and by the staff themselves. So I'm very proud that we've got a code of practice in place which now indeed has worldwide recognition.
Great, thank you. And also a big story I covered more recently, just before you left, was your calls for more technology expertise at the ICA, for more resources. Was obviously a call throughout office, but... Well,
one of the big battles which I finally won almost the week that I stood down was to get more resources and more powers for the Information Commissioner's office. It did take almost 3 years, but I'm delighted, absolutely delighted, that my successor will now have more resources, because we have about 300,000 companies notifying us of their data processing activity. They each pay £35, but the government has now agreed that the largest companies will in future, in fact from now, pay £500. So it's quite a big increase, but £500 is not very much for a large corporation, but it will make a very big difference. It will push up the budget of the Information Commissioner's office quite substantially. And so now they will be able to do some of the things which I wasn't able to do, particularly, for example, employing more IT expertise, more investigators, more auditors to carry out the work more effectively.
In technical expertise, what kind of skills exactly is the ICO missing?
I don't think it's missing any skills, because although we had a limited staff, we could call upon advisors and consultants and people to help. So we had our finger on the pulse. We had a good reputation within the United Kingdom and globally for being thought leaders, for being ahead of the game, being on top of what's actually happening out there in the marketplace. And you've got to lead and you've got to react as a regulator. You've got to stand up and say what needs to be done for the future. You've got to voice concerns, but at the same time you've got to respond to political developments, to technological developments, and to other changes going on around us. And life never stands still. Changes are happening on a daily or weekly basis.
So in your idea then, I expect that funding should increase with technology advances, but how do we monitor? I mean, at what stage do we increase funding next for the...
Well, I don't think there'll be the new fees came into force on the 1st of October 2009, and that will increase the budget from about £11 million to about £17 million. So it's a really big increase for the office, and that is going to allow Christopher Graham, who is the new commissioner, the scope to do some of the things which I didn't have the money to do. But it was a fight. I had to press the government very hard, but I'm delighted I won that particular fight. And also not just more money, but stronger powers to carry out inspections and audits, and also the power to impose civil penalties where companies deliberately or recklessly ignore the data protection requirements. So I think one of my achievements, if you like, is to make data protection far more mainstream, to make it far more important, and far more people now understand its importance.
Right, and another battle you won while you were in office was the battle against the government's plans of the super database to monitor all our communications, emails and so forth, in one big super database. And you mentioned then you warned of a surveillance state, and I think you said we were sleepwalking into George Orwell's 1984 type.
Well, many years ago I made some speeches and I said, are we sleepwalking indeed into a surveillance society? And I published a report in 2006 which documented some of the dangers facing people if too much information is collected and used without proper debate. Now, many examples of collections of identity cards and with collections inside government departments of adults and children and so on. And one particular issue which you've just mentioned, about 18 months ago, I said I thought it would be a step too far for the British way of life for a vast governmental database to be put in place to record details of all our telephone calls, all our email exchanges, internet shopping and so on. And this was on the agenda then. I was delighted that the government later backed away from this. There are some real concerns. The government does need to look out to prevent terrorism and serious crime. I was very much aware of that, but I thought that would not be acceptable to have so much intrusion into people's private activities, because privacy is a very personal matter. People don't like their conversations and their activities being monitored by government. There's a balance to be achieved, and government is now looking for different ways forward.
So do you believe that we are living in a surveillance state at the moment?
No, I don't. I mean, we're not remotely living in a surveillance state such as they had in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or other parts of the world where there is a totalitarian, authoritarian regime. But that's not to say we can be complacent. We've got to be aware that information can be abused, that people value their personal data very fully, and we've seen over the last 100 years where it can be used by forces who are not well disposed towards the general public, and therefore we've got to make sure the infrastructure is not in place to be abused. We've always got to do no more than is necessary. That's why, you know, both as Commissioner and now with the Centre for Information Policy Leadership, the law firm Hunton and Williams, we're very much focused on educating organisations, the government and companies to get it right first time. Nobody wants to obey laws for the sake of obeying laws. They want to do it because it's a matter of self-interest, and that's what we try and get the message across. Get it right in the first place and you'll avoid problems with the law and you'll preserve your reputation.
Okay. And if we forget government for a second, we think about the amount of data we ourselves put online, and this has already come up in our conversation on social networks. Are we responsible for giving away our freedoms and the amount of in how we've taken to the internet?
Well, we've got to be alert as to the risks of using the internet or any other form of activity, but I do think there's also a very heavy responsibility on governments, but also on companies. I mean, the private sector collects vast amount, whether it's travel, whether it's financial services, credit reference agencies, many private sector bodies are collecting vast amounts of data. And I have to say, sometimes people don't always understand what they're collecting and why there are risks associated with it. So it's a really important message. And often you get somebody perhaps in the middle of an organisation, the IT specialist, they understand the risks, but they have a struggle getting it to the attention of the board. And so I think we can help them a lot. And some of the media coverage, for example, helps them get the message to the top of the organisation that these things really matter. You can very rarely do it all in one place. It can't just be done in the IT department. You've got to use the lawyers, you've got to use human resources. Everyone must be in a common purpose to avoid some of the problems.
Okay. And what do you think of, at the moment, the Tories putting forward a new proposal to involve the private sector more in databases, really, and lessen the government's super database plans? And one of the examples is the fact that they're thinking of Google and Microsoft hosting our medical records. What do you think of that proposal?
Well, you're trying to draw me into politics now, and as Commissioner and now working in the private sector, I didn't get too far drawn into politics, but certainly I'm aware that the Conservatives published a paper about 4 or 5 weeks ago. I was quoted in the first paragraph of that document by name, and I think 5 other paragraphs. So they seem to have taken on board some of the words that I issued when I was Commissioner, and maybe that's flattering, maybe that's pleasing. But I think all the political parties, Conservative, Liberal and Labour, are now woken up to the fact that people are concerned about excessive surveillance, excessive database activity, and I welcome that, because that was my mission for 6 years, to try and raise awareness, and maybe it's a success now. It's become quite a lively political issue. It's not just happened in the United Kingdom, it's happened in other countries as well. And so the Conservatives have announced, they want to try and limit database activity. And you mentioned also National Health Service, where at the moment there's been a very big scheme for electronic health records, which I had some anxieties about, because it was a very monolithic scheme with virtually every adult and child in this country having electronic health records accessible by very large numbers of people right across the health service. And I think the Conservatives in their paper have woken up to some of the risks, and they're going to be exploring maybe other ways of doing it, because there are benefits in electronic health records, but it must be done in a way which doesn't cause some of the problems.
Okay, all right, thanks Richard, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.